This is the Detroit Sports Podcast Network.
The state of the greatest rivalry of them all, Michigan and Ohio State. Next on this week's episode of Michigan Podcast.
But there's going to be one team that's going to play solely as a team. No man is more important than the team. No coach is more important than the team. The team, the team, the team.
Looks deep for Anthony Clark. Waits for it. Hit. Caught.
They said you can't beat Ohio State. Now what?
Brady gets terrific. Throws it. And a touchdown. Knight again. Schultz just before Frizzell got him. And a leaping interception by Woodson.
Harbaugh back to throw over the middle. Caught by Colaguard at the 5 on his feet. Touchdown, Michigan. On its way. It's good.
He's 5'7", 179 pounds, a junior at Michigan. But Jamie Morris packs a wallop, and he delivers for Bo Schembechler.
And here's your first play. Pressure coming. Second. It is Glenn Steele, number 81, who fought his way through the traffic.
Option. And Robinson calls his own number, and he's going to score. Oh, an easy touchdown for Robinson and Michigan.
We're going to win the championship again because we're going to play as a team. And when we play as a team and the old season is over, you and I know it's going to be Michigan again. Michigan.
Go Blue, I'm Steve Deace. Welcome to a new episode of Michigan Podcast. And we're going to be assessing, it is that time of year, by the way, we just had President's Day earlier this week, and it is normally the time of year when presidents do give a State of the Union address. But what about a state of our disunion, the state of the greatest rivalry in sports, the most defining rivalry in college football, at least, Michigan and Ohio State? Where do things stand? We'll talk about that a little bit more with our good friend and fellow rivalry partaker, although from the Bucknut side of things, Mark Rogers, coming up in the next segment of the show. But let me lead off with some of my thoughts, because I think we're at a curious juncture in the history of this greatest rivalry. On one hand, it is quite possible that this is one of the golden eras of this game, and certainly the greatest era since the 10-year war. It has been a mercurial history of this game that it has been rare that both teams have been consistently great simultaneously. Yes, there have been years where, like 2006, for example, Ohio State's 1 and Michigan is 2, but the year before that, Michigan went 7-5, right? So most of the time, like 1995 and 1996, Michigan beat number 2 ranked Ohio State teams in back-to-back years. Well, those 95 and 96 Michigan teams combined to have 7 losses. Most of the time, there is not an era of consistent greatness between the two schools simultaneously. And that one exception was the 10-year war. Now, as the 10-year war between Woody and Bo droned on, Michigan became clearly the superior program. Ohio State had kind of top 12 teams a lot those last few years. Didn't score an offensive touchdown against Michigan in Woody's last 3 years. Rick Leach comes in, the Peach, sets the all-time NCAA touchdown record, for which it's a crime that he's not still yet in the College Football Hall of Fame. And Michigan clearly asserts itself as now the dominant team in the rivalry. But the early years of that rivalry, they were simultaneously great. In fact, from 1972 to 1974, Michigan went 32-1 overall and shared the Big Ten championship with Ohio State every year, but never played in a bowl game because of the postseason rules the Big Ten had at the time. So what we have right now is a Pax Romana of this rivalry. Michigan and Ohio State have won the last 2. undisputed national championships. They are going to dominate now 2 years in a row. The NFL draft. Michigan did it a year ago. Ohio State is poised to do it this year. They just signed the consensus top 2 quarterbacks in the class of 2025. Tavian St. Clair for Ohio State. Bryce Underwood coming in at the University of Michigan. So there appears to be no signs of slowing down. Michigan's head coach has already got 2 wins over Ohio State, one of them as an interim. He's not even 40 years old yet, talking about Sharon Moore. And Ryan Day just signed a lucrative extension after winning Ohio State's first national championship since 2014 under Urban Meyer. So there appears to be a golden era here where both teams are thriving and flourishing at the same time. But paradigm shifts in college football absolutely threaten, I would say, maybe the sanctity of this rivalry. It'll never not be fierce. It'll never not be great. But I could foresee a scenario in the not too distant future. In fact, this past year alone might have been a foreshadowing of things to come, where it becomes more like Duke, North Carolina basketball, where it is still a great rivalry. It is still probably the defining rivalry in that particular sport, but it doesn't have the existential angst where the option of ruining the other team's season by beating them, where it's win or go home, like in 2023 when it's number 2 and number 3, or 2022 where it's number 2 and number 3, or 2021 where it's number 4 and number 6, or number 2 and number 6, I should say. So we're in a situation now where, look at this last year. Ohio State technically finished 4th in the Big Ten. And no Buckeye cares, nor should you. If you're a Bucknut, you should not care. You won the freaking national championship. Who cares where you finished in the Big Ten? Michigan lost 5 games. Folks, there is not a commenter in the comment section of Michigan podcast that would not have, if I would have said, should Sharon Moore be fired after year 1 if he loses 5 games, would have said no. 100%, absolutely fire his ass. Year 1, if you lose 5 games with this team, you're done. Yet, just like no Ohio State fan remembers finishing 4th in the Big Ten because they won the Natty, no Michigan fan right now remembers losing 5 games because they beat Ohio State and then topped it off by beating Alabama in a bowl game. These are things that now are possible as expectations are reimagined with a broader scoped sport. And the possibility now that not everything is lose or leave town match, lose or go home, existential in nature, and that there are still opportunities to reach your greater goals despite whatever the outcome of the particular game is. Is that good for the game? Is it bad for the game? That remains to be seen, but it will be different for the game nevertheless. When we come back, we'll find out what Mark Rogers thinks about that here next. Well, let's get the other half of the state of the disunion of the great rivalry known as Michigan and Ohio State, where, of course, I am representing today, asking the question, what's this year's excuse after 4 in a row? Our good friend Mark Rogers joins us now. Good to see you, Mark. Check out Mark's new book if you're looking for some off-season content to keep the fires burning, as REO Speedwagon once sang. Before you know it, it'll be spring football around the country. Get his new book, Disputed National Champions, College Football's Historical 1990s Reset, and of course, our beloved Michigan Wolverines would be a part of that conversation based on what happened in 1997. And we'll get into some of this stuff in Mark's book here coming up on the back half of this interview. But Mark, I kind of laid out my state of the rivalry, where things stand. And I just to kind of summarize in brief, I think we're kind of in a golden age of the rivalry right now. Michigan and Ohio State have won the last 2 undisputed national championships. Ohio State is poised to, Michigan did a year ago, dominate the NFL scouting combine and then the NFL draft. The consensus top 2 quarterback recruits in this incoming class, Tavian St. Clair for Ohio State and Bryce Underwood for Michigan, end up, signing with the Buckeyes and Wolverines. Sharon Moore kind of established himself towards the end of last year. Ryan Day may have finally established himself in Columbus by winning a national championship. So these two might be going back and forth for the foreseeable future. So I kind of think, given where these 2 programs are at right now, that we're kind of in a golden age of this rivalry. But what say you?
Well, it's something I mentioned last night. We did a show, a Ohio State, Michigan, all everything program debate show. And at one point in the show, while I was trashing Michigan's history and trying to do everything I possibly could to raise Ohio State above Michigan, I hit on that very point that you just hit on. I said, there's one thing that these two fan bases should be able to unite in, and that would be SEC domination for at least the last 15 years in college football. And now this rivalry, the greatest in sports, owns these two national championships, an expanded, better than ever Big Ten. And it's been stated for years and years and years. And if we could ever get Ohio State and Michigan at a certain place, both of them on top of their game at the same time to take down the SEC, then those are the two that they're the beacon that is needed by the Big Ten to play big boy football with the SEC. Now, because this rivalry has been the greatest, but it does on a national scale has had that regional feel to, is either one of these schools, one of these teams in this particular year really ready to take on an SEC champion? And the great majority of the time, unfortunately, that answer has been no. Ohio State has popped up at times and been able to meet the challenge. It's been forever for Michigan prior to the last few seasons. And now we're looking at a golden age of college football from a certain perspective. I don't believe that it's the golden age for us purists, but from a power standpoint, from a financial standpoint, and from the standpoint of SEC and Big Ten dominance, we're moving ourselves into a golden age. And yes, for all the reasons that you just cited, that 8-5 out of Michigan, I don't think tells us much about the state of the program. I think it's a blip on the radar. I think this will be one of the top programs in college football going forward, as will Ohio State.
There is discussion on our end about how much Ohio State, which first of all, let me just say as a preamble to what I'm about to say, blows my mind that this is even a talking point. Okay. And I do think what happens on social media matters. And I think it matters more than I used to think it does. I also don't think it's the entirety of representation of a group of people either. I mean, even as prominent and popular, the surge that X has experienced under Elon Musk, where registered users and active accounts have surged in the last couple of years, at best, 30% of Americans have an active X account, at best. Okay, so it is representative of a significant portion of people, but not really a significant population or significant portion of the overall population. Maybe in many respects, social media has become a supersized version of what message boards were 20 years ago, where it's where the P1s who are the most engaged actively congregate and hang out. And so their opinions matter, but there's a lot more people sitting in the stands and watching at home than just those P1s, right? Okay. Well, in the arena of social media, there's a conversation happening on the Michigan side of things that has transcended our ecosystem. I saw one of the talk shows, I think it was Josh Pate talking about this on CBS Sports recently, okay? That the rivalry now, after all the levels of really just unseemly obsession Ohio State has demonstrated where this rivalry is concerned my entire lifetime, that they now suddenly are downplaying the rivalry after losing 4 in a row and winning the national championship. It doesn't matter. It's not that big of a deal. How much of that, Mark, is a Michigan fan online troll talking point? How much of that is real? Like I saw a young man sitting in the midst there at Value City Arena in Columbus on Sunday at the basketball game, sitting there just in a sea of scarlet and gray, not wearing just any Michigan gear, but depicting the planting of the flag that started a near riot, okay, last November. And yeah, he got booed and stuff, but I would have said like a year or two ago, I don't know that guy's getting out of there alive. Okay. Like I can't even believe they even let him in the arena doing that, taking his own life like that. All right. So is that a Michigan talking point, or are you seeing that on your side of things?
Okay. If I was evaluating this situation from an outside perspective, if this was going on, let's say with Oklahoma and Texas, I would be saying as an outside college football analyst, let's say This was Oklahoma winning 4 straight, but Texas just won the national championship. This is just Texas's excuse, Texas fans to say, you know what? This is a new age of college football. This rivalry stuff doesn't matter. We can win natties without it. That's what it is. We don't really care. It's a blip on the radar. We moved on from there. And I would not take that. I would not accept that. I would not agree with them, nor would I believe them. However, I gotta say, I experienced it this season. I didn't make any objective, logical demarcation to say, this is how I'm going to feel or approach this situation now that Ohio State has lost again to Michigan. Now we're marching on to the playoffs. This was all visceral. This was all just how I felt. Yes, that's the most important game on the sports calendar still. But I don't know if it has 25 or 30% the significance for me. I'm talking personally for me than it did 25 years ago, 10 years ago. And I felt that way even before Ohio State completed the run. When they were lining up against Tennessee, I felt as though this is a new season. The layers and layers of those rounds of playoffs gave that so much of an NFL feel. I don't know that it's going to diminish to this point, but I almost had vibes of Ravens, Steelers, Cowboys, Redskins. Yes, Packers, Bears. You want to beat that team twice in your division. They're an old standing rival, but okay, move on to the NFL playoffs. Does anyone remember if the Steelers beat the Ravens twice when the Ravens go on and win a Super Bowl? No. I don't want to take it to that degree. Michigan fans, don't get me wrong. I'm not stating that. But I'm just saying how I felt about that as the wins were building and the momentum for that Ohio State team and rolling through Oregon and then on to Texas. And that was just kind of like, that was a long time ago. And no, I don't want that loss on the record, but my position is certainly flipped. And again, this is all visceral. This is not a logical decision because I would have told you in 1985, 95, 05, national championship or beat Michigan. Beat Michigan. You didn't even have to finish the question. Beat Michigan. That's all that matters. That's number one. Not all that matters, but that's number one. And the rest, hey, we'll take the national championship, of course. But now it's not even close the other way for me personally.
So listen, we're friends, but we also think on this topic, the other one is just existentially dead cosmically wrong. Okay. But because we're friends, we don't look to put each other in no-win scenarios. Right. And so I recognize for you as an Ohio State fan, you're in a no-lose scenario with me, as someone like me asking you this question. Okay. On one hand, we want to chastise and condemn you guys. And I think frankly, to be fair, honestly so, for being way too obsessed about this, to unhealthy points, frankly. Okay. But then on the other hand, when it seems like, there actually is football other than the Michigan game, and yeah, we'd like to beat their brains in, but there's other things happening in life and winning championships still feels pretty good. Then we want to criticize you for not caring. Oh yeah, now you don't care now that we have control, right? It's a no-win scenario. Like if I went on any talk show for Ohio State, pick any of your Ohio State guys that went on their show. Steve, your thoughts on Connor Stallions? Well, I mean, it doesn't really matter what you think of what he did because we won all the most important games after he was gone. But you wouldn't have beat Minnesota 52-0 and Michigan State 49-0 with I can't win, right? It's a no-win scenario. You're cornered either way because the other side represents the opposing viewpoint. So it's a no-win scenario. All right. So and acknowledging that is a factor in a conversation like this up front, we acknowledge that. All right. Let's set that aside. Is it possible that this new playoff is going to do to our rivalry what the NCAA tournament did to rivalries like Duke and Carolina, where they still matter greatly, okay? But for people that you and I are barely old enough to remember this, but for the longest time, only one team in a conference could go to the NCAA basketball tournament, okay? And so, that and you'd play that conference tournament in the ACC, that conference tournament championship game, you might be a top 5 team in the country, and if you don't win that game, you're not going to the NCAA tournament. Your season is over. It's over before spring break, right? And so everything was very existential for the longest period of time. And then you're like a couple of years ago when Duke and Mike Krzyzewski's last home game gets rolled at home by North Carolina and they still go to the Final Four, right? I mean, that day still sucked. You didn't want to have your curtain call at Cameron Indoor getting humiliated by your rival, but that was still an incredible basketball season for Duke, which of course ended by losing to Carolina in the Final Four as well. Okay. But I'm wondering if, and you and I said this at the time, there will never be another Michigan-Ohio State game, anticipating this kind of paradigm shift like what we had in 2023. That'll be the very last one, all right, where it is a literal loser leave town match. The next 9 months of your life is empty, unfulfilled, and ruined if you lose, right? Okay. And you're carrying that with you the entire rest of the time, for better or for worse. And that was the dynamic you and I were born into during the 10-year war that largely existed even as the Big Ten went to divisions and everything else. It's kind of gone now. And somehow Ohio State could finish fourth in the Big Ten and still look like the absolute best team in the country for the next 3 weeks, just rolling on the way to winning the national championship. Somehow Michigan can lose 5 games with 10 guys invited the NFL scouting combine. And it feels like we had a hell of a season because we ended it by beating Ohio State and then Alabama, is the cherry on top. Is it possible without just creating our own cop-outs and narratives when you're in a rivalry and you hate losing to the other guy, so you rationalize it? Is it possible that there is an overall paradigm shift here we're all going to experience at some point? And now we're talking as soon as 26, we're going to expand to 14 or 16, which this dynamic becomes even more set in. Is this just going to, in a natural sense, detoxify some of the air around this rivalry? Because the odds that one team is going to have success exclusively at the expense of the other team is not necessarily the perennial threat that's existed much of our lives anymore.
Well, since you dipped into another sport, Steve, we're big Major League Baseball fans over the course of our lifetime. You brought in the NCAA basketball tournament. The first one that I watched was the famous Bird Magic 1979 showdown. So I missed one team gets in, John Wooden dominates the West and shuts everybody else off. And that's the only game. And you went very well through the North Carolina Duke dynamic. But we've never had this. We're used to that in other sports. You have to be, pushing 65, 70 to remember that type of setup and structure in the other sports. A Major League Baseball without the American and National League Championship Series, or the San Francisco Giants winning 103 games when the Atlanta Braves won 104 in 1993, and they got shut off with the second best record in baseball and couldn't go to the playoffs. It's become so wide open in the other sports, and it becomes a best of 7 all over the place in baseball and basketball, that this has been the one sacred sport from that dynamic standpoint where a game is everything, and that's been taken away. So that's why I think it's so difficult to comprehend or to grasp, is because we're used to the other sports being like that. Okay, we lost tonight. We'll see you on Friday night for game 4. But this is just a paramount shift in this. I do think, and thinking back to 2006, I was young and dumb at the time, I guess, because after Ohio State beat Michigan and there was talk about them playing a rematch in the national championship game, I was like, bring it on. I'd love to see that again. Let's see it again. Today I'd be like, no, we're done with them. We won the game. Let's move on to anybody else. But the first time, for me at least, I'm anticipating my response to the first time there's a rematch, let alone a three-peat possibly, is the novelty is going to be kind of cool. I think people are going to get into that rematch mentality the first time. Then after that, I think too much of a good thing takes away the special quality of this matchup. Too much of a good thing, and it will never be the same. And as you said, we were fortunate enough to get, although from the Ohio State side, we were not, to win the game, but 11-0 versus 11-0 in 2023. That it was one of those things that should happen in sports. It should happen in life that way, and it rarely does. that at the end of an era, the two teams played to that summit to match the end of the era, to give us the game and the matchup that we needed in that moment, and we'll never see again.
To that end then, Mark, and you know this history better than I do, but isn't there a stat something like every Ohio State coach until Ryan Day that had lost 3 in a row to Michigan got fired? Like going back to like post-World War II, I think that's been the issue, right? If you look, now we don't know, Woody's kind of a technicality because it applies to him too, but his firing happened because he suffered a 3rd straight loss to Michigan, then punched, the nose tackle of Clemson on national TV on New Year's Eve in a bowl game, right? So chances are he probably doesn't get fired. You know this better than me, but he's probably not getting fired if he doesn't do that, right? So it wouldn't have applied to him. But technically, like every Ohio State coach until Ryan Day that ever lost 3 in a row to Michigan got canned for like 50 years. Well, in this new paradigm, is there an amount of times, I mean, I'd like to test this theory, of course, but is there an amount of times that Ryan Day could consecutively lose to Michigan? And if they are a consistent, relevant, if not contending and even winning national playoff team in those years, does it just not matter anymore?
It's such a statistical outlier that this is going to continue, that Ohio State is racking up 90% winning percentages under Ryan Day, or practically, but losing to Michigan and going 40-0 against the rest of the Big Ten during that same time. So, but if it did happen and he's going to Final Fours, let's say, they're living in the Final Four of the semifinals at the CFP every year, but they're losing to Michigan. I don't know how to deal with that. I don't know what the answer to that is. In a previous life, in what college football has been all the way through to 2023, no, he doesn't survive. That game's too important. But if he's got a national championship in his back pocket and they're going deep into the playoffs every year, when does that start to matter? 0-6, 0-7?
I don't know the answer to that because, again, we're undergoing a paradigm shift. It's not the same sport as we've always known it. And what remains to be the case is whether it's going to be better or worse. What is not debatable is it's not the same.
What I just said there, Steve, I'm calling myself out, is the same thing I get on Michigan fans for when I see 0-4, 0-4, 0-4, 0-4, and I correct them and say, Ryan Day is not 0-4 against Michigan. He's 1-4. You've won 4 consecutive games. I love these sectioning off of the rivalry. I sometimes respond when I get an 0-4 tweet. I respond 8-4. Okay.
Well, it's like when you wanted to debate me last year on which program has been the better one historically, and I will tell me what the benchmark era is. If we're going back to the history of college football, we are. And we literally us in Notre Dame literally wrote college football history pre-World War II. Literally. We were the whole sport. Okay?
You're taking everything into context. But
if your context is post-World War II or post-integration, Ohio State's clearly been the better program at that point. So, I mean, it depends on what your benchmark is. What period of time are we starting from, right?
My benchmark is that a game in 2024 is more valid than a game in 1901.
I agree with that completely too. I mean, I think to me, the benchmark ultimately, when you have to look at like really post-World War II and full integration of the sport, in my view. And in that case, Michigan would go from either number 1 or number 2 greatest program to probably number 4 or number 5. Okay.
And those were some of my points in our debate show last night. And I was not trashing on Michigan. I was just trying to bring to light some things that, unfortunately, there's not again, I'm going to use this term, demarcation, to say suddenly the sport became legit in 1922 or 1951. The segregation aspect of it, though,
right around the time Woody Hayes got hired, coincidentally. Yes.
I'm sorry, what's that?
Right around the time Woody Hayes got hired.
When I said 51, yeah, very good. That's subliminal. But I sometimes go to 1970, and I am Michigan fans just going nuts. You're just grabbing you're cherry picking. And I'm okay. Look up the term cherry picking. 55 years of cherry picking. That's not exactly cherry picking. There's a reason I sometimes go to 1970. 70+% of the NFL players are black. There is something to it. I'm not saying that we don't count everything before 1970 or before World War II, because, hey, I'm sure you've done it as well. I went back to 1869 and went through every season of college football thinking, can I find a time where I can somewhat legitimately say, okay, this is when the sport became legitimate and valid. And you just can't do it. The evolution is too slow, too gradual. But I know that when Rutgers split 2 games with Princeton in 1869 and says, we are the national champions, it's not as valid as a national championship in 2023 and 2024.
This brings back the college basketball argument. Is the fact that John Wooden and UCLA did not have to play runners-up in any other conferences, including their own, does it make what they did, 10 out of 12, more or less impressive? On one hand, it was a tournament of champions every year, right? I mean, it was essentially the final Sunday at Augusta National after the cut line every single year, right? Okay. On the other hand, though, the amount of variance is greatly diminished when you don't have, 150 golfers going out there during the day before the winds pick up. And now the greens are all softened by them playing on them. And now the winds have picked up. That adds even to more variance, right? I don't know the answer. The first year we went to 64 teams, 1985, a number 8 seed, Villanova, who finished like 6th in the Big East, won the national championship. Okay.
Shot 68% from the field. Yes, they did.
So I don't know the answer to that. You could look at it both ways, right? Does the fact that Ohio State had to still beat a whole bunch of high quality teams to win it add more credence to what they just did? Or the fact that in the sport as we had known it for the previous century, they would not have even gotten to the playoff at all, okay? Or even been a factor in a national championship by virtue of not being a factor in their conference race. You see what I'm saying? We could look at this thing both ways.
I have no issue, Steve. I have no issue with Michigan fans saying, we won 4 straight games in the series. I would be doing the same thing. Absolutely. I have one thing where I believe I've stopped both of these fan bases in their tracks is I've said, you know what? If you are honest with yourself, you don't have to utter this even under your breath, but if you are internally honest, if we flipped histories, you Michigan fans would be arguing all the Ohio State points, and all the Ohio State fans would be arguing all of the Michigan points.
Of course. Yes. Absolutely. That's absolutely
what I did the other day, Steve, was instead of doing what the typical Ohio State angle is, and that's count backwards from 2024, I went to the beginning and counted forward, and I stopped at the AP poll era 1936. So everything pre-36. Michigan currently has 34 more wins than Ohio State. They had 169 more wins in 1935. They led in Big Ten championships 15-4, and they led in national championships 8-0. And it's also kind of hard to win a Big Ten championship when you're actually not yet in the Big Ten. So Ohio State was down 6-0 before they ever entered the conference.
Well, we could argue this history all night long. So let's do it a little bit longer. I mentioned your new book, Disputed National Champions, College Football's Historical 1990s Reset. And you think of the decade began in 1990 with, yes, folks, this actually happened. If you're a millennial or younger, Georgia Tech and Colorado ended up sharing the national championship. No one went undefeated and untied in that year. Georgia Tech had no losses, but had a tie. And then Colorado had a loss and a tie. And probably a second loss with the infamous 5th down at Missouri that didn't get called, right? Okay. And so those two teams end up sharing the national championship the next year in 1991. We have it again with the University of Washington and Miami sharing the national championship. In 1994, a lot of people thought we should have had a shared national championship with Nebraska and Penn State. And Penn State was actually rated number 1 until late in the year. They didn't cover the spread against a pretty decent Indiana team. And Nebraska ended up taking their spot at number 1 and then ended up beating Miami in the Orange Bowl and being given that national championship. That was kind of a controversial one. 1997, of course, is a year we all know very well in my neck of the woods with Michigan and Nebraska. And the coaches end up, and we believe because Phil Fulmer somebody voted Michigan 4th in the coaches poll. Somebody voted Michigan 4th in the final 1997 coaches poll. And we have always believed it as Phil Fulmer as a protest for Charles Woodson beating Peyton Manning for the Heisman. That is, and he's never denied it. He's been asked, and he's never denied it. That is a Michigan urban legend. We believe Phil Fulmer is the culprit who voted us 4th so that Nebraska could just narrowly beat us in the coaches poll to win that national championship. But this is all history you write about in your book, Mark.
So basically what I've done in this book, and the reason I chose the 90s, Steve, was I have determined this to be the most impactful decade in the history of college football toward determining a champion. Because from the aforementioned 1936 with the entry of the AP poll all the way into the 1990s, it was simply, you remember this time, we'd watch the Sugar Bowl and the Orange Bowl on New Year's night after the Rose Bowl and the Fiesta and the Cotton. And we thought we knew who won the national championship, but we didn't know officially. We didn't know for sure. Could it be them or them? It's probably them. We'd have to wake up in the morning and get our newspaper and then see, right, okay, Miami's the national champion. Oh, good. Okay, got it.
And there were years, like in 1977, Notre Dame was number 5 heading into New Year's Day and ends up winning the national championship. 1983, Miami was number 4 heading into the bowl games and ends up winning the national championship. And so you did have to, there were 8 or 9 of these games every New Year's Day, and you really had to pay attention to them because a lot of times there'd be a lot of intra-conference matchups. So multiple games would have a bearing on the national championship in any given year.
So the reason I chose the 90s was first we had the introduction of the Bowl Coalition, which matched 1 and 2 to say, okay, because certainly when I started watching college football, I love New Year's Day more than just about anything. But I did wonder, until I, of course, was educated on the process, why does number 1 play number 7 and number 2 plays number 6 and 3 plays 17? And we know what it is. Well, the Bowl Coalition at least got 1 and 2 together, as long as they weren't in the Big Ten or the Pac-10, right, because they were like, no, we don't want any part of this. We're playing in the Rose Bowl. So that partially fixed the issue. And then we finally got to the BCS, of course, in 1998. So what I do in this book is I take each season and I pretty much set up the season. Okay, who were supposed to be the main players? What was the preseason hype? And then I take us through the season. What were the key matchups, the key games, the controversial plays, the big plays? Then, based on the conclusion of the regular season, what were determined to be the postseason matchups? What were the rankings preseason? And then at the end of the regular season, okay, what were the postseason matchups? How did those play out? And then here are the final rankings. And did they make sense? Were they valid? Who got screwed? Who got left out? Did they have a resume that was just as good as the voted national champion? And then I write a conclusion to each chapter to say, well, this is the end of an era, or this is why this season has lasted and had an impact through the next couple of decades. But the fun part of this, well, that was fun. That's enough for me right there, the history and the revisionist history that I like to apply. But beyond that, Steve, I took each one of these seasons and I plugged it into I didn't want this to just be a history book. I plugged it into the BCS era. So I laid out what would have happened in 1990, 91, 92, all the way through 99 in the BCS era. What would have happened in the 4-team college football playoff era? What would have happened in the 12-team era? And now also I included the proposed 14-team rankings. So you see that in each season, and it as you can imagine, delivers some odd rankings, the likes of Southern Miss and East Carolina making playoffs in a 12 or 14 team playoff. And because at one time in the early 90s, we had 7 conferences, some of those really highly ranked Miami and Notre Dame teams, well, they had to get to the back of the line and be ranked 7th or 8th in the country behind all the conference champions. So that's what I attempted to do, and also line up the conference championship games, what they would have looked like then had there been conference championship games, but also what they would look like in the current alignment.
So let's go back to 97, since that's the one that's going to be the most parochial to our viewership base, obviously. What do you think of the way that turned out? So, because my issue is I love feeling morally superior. Okay, I love it. That's what makes me such a good Michigan fan. And so I have a tendency to look at the arguments I have for my favorite team and say, hey, if I flip this around, would it hold up? Otherwise, it's a fallacy, right? You know? And so I've never had a problem with sharing that national championship with Nebraska because of that. We didn't play them. Maybe because I live in Iowa, that I got a lot of the old Big 12 football, you know, in the old days of regional coverage still. That was kind of towards the end of that era, but it was still happening. So I watched a lot of Big 12 football as well as Big 10 football. Those Nebraska teams were absolutely dominant. Yeah, they kind of had a fluky win at a pretty good Missouri team where the guy caught the ball off the kick, right? Okay, but you know, we had a couple of close calls that year as well. You're going to have that, particularly in a conference where there's familiarity. They absolutely destroyed Tennessee in that Orange Bowl. And I've just kind of thought to myself, well, if the shoe was on the other foot and it just got taken from us, even though we did everything that we were supposed to do, it would bother me. And so I never really had a problem with it. What I did have a problem with was the language Scott Frost used after the game, that you're basically a moron if you don't vote for us. Sean McDonough, who just openly campaigned during the game. Like, guys, we played the toughest schedule in the country. I mean, we were at the time, that was not since BYU had a team started the year as rated as low as we were in a preseason poll and gone on to win and go undefeated and win an undisputed national championship. Okay. And I mean, it felt like it was kind of being done while dissing us at the exact same time. I would have felt much better about it too if the coaches had Nebraska won the whole time and the media had us won, and then we both win and they can't decide. But then it happens because one coach votes as fourth. So the principle of sharing that with them, I don't know who would have won if we had played. I frankly think 10 to 14 points would have won the game. Those two defenses that year. It could be argued that Michigan 97 historically was one of the best defenses in the history in 20th century college football, or at least since the forward pass, you know, became standard in the sport in the 1980s. I mean, what they did defensively that year was incredible, but that Nebraska defense was no slouch either. Our offense was kind of limited still, you know, so, I mean, I had no problem sharing it with them. I did not like the method though, by which it went down.
I can't disagree with anything you just said. Now, you're not going to be surprised by this because it's refreshing to hear what you just said. And I'm not surprised, though, because I did an off-season call-in show a couple of years ago, 1997, Nebraska versus Michigan. Want to hear from the Nebraska fans, from the Michigan fans? We're going to size this up, look at schedules, look at stats, match up these teams, and just discuss. I did not make a call on this, whether it be in the book or otherwise, because I believe the justice is that both won a national championship. They played extremely difficult schedules. As you mentioned, Michigan, the toughest in the nation. But Nebraska played a legitimate schedule. The Big 12 was extremely good then. Mm-hmm. So they both earned a national championship. I don't even believe in, well, it's a half national championship. That's stupid. It's a national championship for each team. We can go through the years and hand out national championships that would be legitimate championships of other teams that earned it just as much as somebody else that got the vote. I think the conclusion to it was justified, but I can understand your position saying going into postseason play, this is where things stood. This was the opinions of these two groups, the coaches and the writers. Why did it change so drastically? The only thing I'll say to push back on that is obviously, as you alluded to, the Michigan performance against a good Washington State team with Ryan Leaf at quarterback, I believe 8th ranked in the country, if I recall.
Yeah, they were 7th or 8th, one of those two. Yeah.
Yeah, 21-16 final score. Mm-hmm. Not as impressive, of course, as Nebraska. So they got the late
which is why, Mark, if a wide swath of coaches had just said, listen, Nebraska played the number 3 team and named the score. You guys played the number 7 or 8 team and had to come from behind. Again, I wouldn't have argued. The fact one coach voted us fourth to make that happen, right? Like if the coaches had gotten together and had a decisive verdict that they just thought that was the more impressive performance, that's fine. But a coach voted us fourth. You watched the entire 1997 college football season and you came to the conclusion Michigan was the fourth best team. That's trying to game an outcome. That's spiteful, and that's what bothered me.
Instead of doing your job, you're gaming an outcome instead of just you singularly doing your job and voting correctly. I do think that you have a great point with the Missouri game. Yes, Michigan won close games, but there's a difference between making plays, legitimate football plays, to come back and win a game or hold off a worthy opponent. That was a lucky play. And I don't believe in luck as being a power or a force, but in any given situation, somebody can be lucky. If there was a ball bounce between you and I, a football, it's most likely going to bounce in some weird way toward one of us. And one of us got lucky in that instance. That doesn't mean we ourselves are lucky. We were just lucky. And Nebraska was lucky on that play. And without that play, they lose a football game. That's not one of those that it was 3rd and 15 at midfield. Right. And so they didn't have to convert the fourth. No, the game was over. They were done. So that's, to me, the biggest Michigan claim. Again, slightly tougher schedule as well.
Well, we've been lucky 4 years in a row, obviously. All pure luck. Yeah. All pure luck. Mark, people want to get the book. How can they do that?
It's on Amazon. Just look up Disputed National Champions. That's one way to do it. Or if you check out any of the videos on my channel, it's right at the top of the description section with a link right there. But it's on Amazon, Disputed National Champions. And if you buy it for just one reason, it's because there's a certain guy that wrote the foreword to it that I've got some respect for.
And if you want an increase in your self-worth, self-esteem, and really just a broader and more fulfilled perspective, look up the results of the last 4 Michigan-Ohio State football games. You can do that as well.
They're right here. I don't have to look them up.
Good to see you, brother. Good luck with the book, man. Talk to you later.
Thanks, Steve. I appreciate it.
You bet. Congrats on the Natty. This week's X-Poll results, we asked you, Michigan was a number 4 seed in the NCAA tournament bracket preview released this weekend. Based on how you think Michigan will finish, you think the Wolverines' actual seed on Selection Sunday will be better, worse, or the same? Results here, pretty split. 40% said the same, 32% said worse, 29% said better. I think all 3 of those options are absolutely possible. The most important number for Michigan right now, I think, is 3. Michigan has 12 wins right now in the Big Ten. I think 15 all but guarantees at least a share of the Big Ten championship. There has not been a first-year basketball coach that has won at least a share of a Big Ten championship since Bo Ryan did it in 2002. So, I mean, if you're walking in the steps previously forged by one Bo Ryan, top 5, top 6 all-time Big Ten basketball coach, if you're Dusty May, and if you're a Michigan fan, those are that's a good shadow to be in for sure. That brings us to our feedback of the week this week. And TJ Ronan says, runs a bend but don't break defense. Belichick and Brady carried him. Players hate him. He's talking about Matt Patricia. But Rick says, hey, what about Chip Kelly? He wasn't great in the NFL. He did great at Ohio State. You guys don't know what you're talking about. Well, Rick, neither do you. Chip Kelly's first 2 years in the NFL, he actually won 10 games with the Eagles. He had one bad year. He was with the 49ers. He was there 1 year. They went 2-14. They were awful. But Chip Kelly was a way better head coach in the NFL than Matt Patricia was. Way better. Chip also had a long-standing track record of success, really took the Oregon program to unprecedented success. Success that it hasn't enjoyed either before or after he left. At least not yet. Maybe Dan Lanning will get there, but he hasn't so far. And Matt Patricia, just what has the guy done on his own? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. And like almost all the Belichick disciples, not named Nick Saban and Kirk Ferentz, have been tremendous disappointments when they tried to break out on their own. So I don't understand the hiring of Matt Patricia to be Ohio State's defensive coordinator at all. Frankly, my first reaction was, did Michigan fans get to hire the Ohio State defensive coordinator? I will be fascinated. Plays a totally different defense than Jim Knowles played. It's more of a read-react, 3-4, with thumper middle linebackers out of the mid-'80s. I will be fascinated to see how that works. I will be fascinated to see how he relates to the players, because when he was our coach with the Lions, he made football for that team the least enjoyable it could possibly be. I mean, he had an open revolt his very first training camp, and it just never subsided from there. So I was stunned that that's who Ohio State hired. Absolutely freaking stunned, but also very thankful. All right, that'll do it for this week's episode of Michigan Podcast. Don't forget to like, rate, share, subscribe, 5-star review. Thanks to all of you that do those things for us. Keep it coming. You can also remember to leave your comments in the comment section as well. Thank you for all of those too. Don't forget, you can follow us in between episodes at Michigan Podcast on X. That's at Michigan Podcast on X. Until the next time, I'm Steve Deace. Go Blue.